What's up, everybody? Welcome to Cooking with Kmad. I'm your host, Kevin Madrigal, also known as Kmad. Today we're going to be working with one of my favorite ingredients, butternut squash, with 3 different recipes. First will be a cream of butternut squash soup, then a cheesy pasta sauce using that soup, and roasted on its own. For the cream of butternut squash soup, you will need 2.5 pounds of butternut squash, approximately 1 regular sized one or 2 small ones in my case, 2 cloves of garlic, half of a yellow onion, 1 cup of coconut milk, 1 teaspoon of vegetable or any kind of bouillon that you like. And for the cheesy pasta sauce, all we will need in addition is some Parmesan cheese, about 1 cup shredded. As always, we will be using some cooking oil, salt, and pepper as well. First, we want to prep our garlic and onions. We're going to be using half of this yellow onion. We want to chop off the top and the bottom. Now we just want to cut it straight in half. Peel off the outermost layers. We're going to cut this half onion into thin strips, also known as a julienne. You just want to cut along these lines. It's alright if they're a little uneven. These are just going to be cooked down. Smash your garlic with a flat object. This is to remove it from the skin. Grab down on your garlic and just start slicing through. Now I like to spread my garlic into a nice little line, put my non-dominant hand on top of the blade like this, and use it as a lever to chop quickly. Repeat this a few times until it's gotten really small. We're going for about that small. So there are no secrets to working with butternut squash. It is a very hard vegetable with a tough skin, but I'll give you a couple of tips. One is to chop off the top and the bottom before you start working with it. Next is, if you're working with a full-size butternut squash, to cut it in half right where the flat part of the butternut squash meets the curve. This will make it a little bit easier to deal with both parts as opposed to just one big thing. We'll want to peel this skin. You can do this one of 2 ways. You can use a vegetable peeler, or you can use your knife. And to use your knife, all you want to do is grab a firm hold and start from the top and just take the skin off. Follow the curve of the butternut squash. Once you finish, flip it over and just check to see if there's any tough skin remaining, and you can take that off if there is. The bottom halves of the butternut squash have seeds, so we'll want to cut these in half. And using a spoon, scrape out all these seeds. Now, since we're going to be making a cream of butternut squash soup, which means that this will be blended, the pieces here can stay relatively large. So I'm going to take this and chop it up into about 6 1-inch sized pieces. As you can see, the butternut squash can be really hard. It's okay to use an extra hand for some support. If you're going to be using an extra hand to push down on your knife, make sure that you've kind of already gotten a groove into the vegetable so that it doesn't have any chance to slip out, and then push it down. Now we're going to get a nice medium-sized pot over a medium-high heat. About 2 tablespoons of oil. We'll first cook our onions. Use a spatula or a wooden spoon to stir it up. We do want to add about 2 teaspoons of salt here. It's important to add the salt now because the salt will actually draw some of the moisture of the onions out and help cook it down. We're going to let this cook for about 2 minutes, just until the onions are starting to become a little translucent. This is called sweating the onions, and so we actually don't want them to caramelize or to brown, we just want them to cook down. Our onions are starting to get just a little translucent, so now we're going to throw in our garlic. And we're going to cook this for about 30 seconds until the garlic is really fragrant. Once the garlic is starting to release all those aromas, dump in all of our butternut squash and mix it all up. We're actually going to fill in water just barely enough to cover the butternut squash. This can be anywhere from 2 to 4 cups of water depending on how much butternut squash you're using. Now we'll add in about a teaspoon of veggie bouillon or any other type of bouillon that you'd like. This is actually completely optional. I just like it because it adds a little bit more richness to the soup. Now we're going to wait for this to come up to a boil and then reduce the flame to a low and then let it cook at a simmer for about 20 minutes. And if you have a lid, it'll make this process go by a little bit faster. While it's simmering, we can begin to work on our butternut squash that we're going to roast. Since we're going to be roasting this, when we're cutting it, we want to make slightly more uniform pieces just so that they all cook at the same time in the oven. You can do this with larger pieces or smaller pieces. I'm going to go for a medium-sized chunk with about 3/4 of an inch. Once you're done, transfer all your butternut squash pieces to a bowl. We're going to add just shy of a tablespoon of oil, pour some in, shake it around, and keep adding until all the pieces are covered and glossy but not dripping with oil. Then we're going to add in about a teaspoon of salt. Transfer this to a baking pan. I like to put foil on mine just to make it clean up a little bit easier so it doesn't stick to the pan. And just try to evenly space them out. Put this in an oven at 425 degrees and check on it in about 15 minutes. Now we're going to grate about a cup of loosely packed Parmesan cheese. If you don't have Parmesan, you can use any other type of melty cheese and add some salt and pepper to adjust the flavor as you like. Set this aside for now. We're going to check on our soup. It has been about 10 to 15 minutes. We're looking for the butternut squash to be fork tender. So you can poke one with a fork and it easily goes through without much resistance. We're about there. Now we want to add in a cup of our coconut milk, let it come up to a simmer, and then shut the heat off. Alright, I added the coconut milk, let it come to a simmer and shut it off. You can let it cool down a little bit because now we're going to blend it. I highly recommend using an immersion blender if you have one. This is also known as a stick blender. You can get one at your local department store for really inexpensive. And if not, you can use a regular blender. But first, I always like to take some liquid out. You can always add this back in. But if your soup comes out too watery, you can't take the liquid out. You can turn this on high and go for it. You want to blend it for at least a couple of minutes until it's become completely smooth. Grab a spoon and taste this. I think it's well salted. I like to add a little bit of fresh cracked black pepper. If you feel like it's not sweet enough for your taste, you can always add a little bit of agave or honey. On a similar note, you can always throw in a little bit of hot sauce or sriracha to give it a little bit of a kick. Or one of my favorite additions is a little squeeze of lime or lemon juice to give it just a little bit of acidity. This is great served just on its own with a little bit of olive oil and some croutons and maybe some of that roasted butternut squash. Speaking of which, a quick sneak peek of our butternut squash. They're starting to get some color on the bottom after 10 minutes. After about 25 minutes in the oven, our butternut squash is done. You can give it a flip halfway through if you'd like to get some even browning, or just leave it on one side and you'll get a really nice char. The last thing that we're going to make is the butternut squash pasta sauce. We're just gonna get a small saucepan over a low-medium heat. Add in anywhere from 1 to 2 cups of our butternut squash soup, and add in our grated cheese. Now, if you'd like to create a dairy-free version of this, I would recommend using a little bit of cornstarch to thicken up the soup and possibly some nutritional yeast or anything else to give it a little bit of extra saltiness or flavor. And give this a whisk. As soon as all the cheese is melted, you can go ahead and shut the heat off. And voila! You got some cheesy, melty butternut squash pasta sauce. I like to eat this with any sort of clamshell or macaroni style pasta that can really pick up the sauce. It has a really nice cheesy but sweet flavor. It's a great alternative to a traditional mac and cheese. Let me know what you thought in the comments. If you have any questions, I'll get back to you. Until next time, this is Cooking with Kmad. That's the money shot.